compelling and engaging. We have our annual conference this year, which will be like last year, both in person and streamed. So that's on December 5th, and that's at the Rotary Center here. And the title is Liftoff, Facilitating the Successful Launch of Emerging Adults. And we'll have us, as usual, in Menninger. It's a Menninger Yellowbrick conference. Also, we'll be joined by Austin Riggs, McLean, and Linden Center. And each of them will have a speaker, and then we will have a panel that will also involve us and those folks. So I think that will be a really neat conference. It's our bailiwick, of course. So stay tuned for more details on that. Also want to remind you of our new publication, Minding the Brain. It's a compendium of articles that we've written over the years here by us and also by some of our affiliated scholars. And it's been on and off the Amazon best-selling list. And so I encourage you to go and look it up and purchase it and keep us on the best-selling list. It's really a cool book. There's a lot of really wonderful articles in there. Okay, without further ado, I want to introduce someone I think you'll find really engaging. Dr. Jaffe has talked to us before, and he's really a great friend of ours. He's one of our greatest sort of supporters here and a great friend of Yellowbrick. He speaks the same language we do. He's a training analyst and supervising analyst at the Chicago Psychoanalytic Institute and an assistant professor at Rush Medical Center and a consultant with us. He's done publications on critiquing psychoanalytic theory, brief psychotherapy, complex dynamic systems approach to adolescent development. That's one of his bailiwicks. And he's going to talk to us tonight about a research project he's been doing that combines research and clinical work and looks at different aspects of how language is used during the therapeutic hour. And I think it's just really fascinating stuff. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Jaffe.
Thank you. I'm going to just jump right in and share my screen here. Okay. I need to do this again.
You can lead people to fish, right?
We can. Okay, so can everybody see this
Yes.
and hear me? Oh, terrific. All right. So happy evening, everybody, and welcome to all of the colleagues that are available. And thanks as always to Yellowbrick for your ongoing support of conversations that really do move our field forward. I'm going to start right in here, hopefully. This is the overview of the territory we're going to cover tonight. I'm calling it a playground because I'm presenting a series of concepts that we can play with and try on and see how they fit together. So here's the overview of the territory. As you can see, there are three main categories. On the left, you see conversation, psychoanalytic models. On the right, you see emotion schemas, and then you see affective neuroscience, and in the middle, you see dancing landscapes. And then in the middle, you see referential process. So I'm going to elaborate and talk about each one of these areas tonight and talk about how they fit together. Now, I'm going to return to this slide often to keep you oriented to where we are in the territory. I hope at the end of this talk, this exploration will leave you with some new thoughts about what we are actually doing when we do psychotherapy and about the common factors that occur in all types of psychotherapy. So let's start with the conversation. Psychotherapy at its most fundamental level is really just a conversation that we use for special purpose. As in any conversation, the therapeutic interaction deploys the full array of behavioral, emotional, and meaning systems that are activated in all human encounters. It's for special purpose because clinicians engage in this universal human behavior to help patients achieve a broader, more flexible level of function and adaptation in their world. And of course, it's ever humbling to be in an experience with a patient where the exchange, the linear flow of words over time opens up an emotion-rich, dimensional understanding of how another person organizes, experiences, and moves through their life. So our clinical work is a rich space of immersion in which we use our models to classify what we observe and experience and make hypotheses about the reasons for our patients' suffering in the present and about the origins of that suffering in their developmental past. We also use our models to guide our interventions and mostly to provide a theory of therapeutic action. In the clinical encounter, therapists generally employ a pretty improvisational approach, using whatever models seem appropriate in the moment to understand their patients. Clinicians bring all of their knowledge and experience, personal and professional, to engage with patients and facilitate change for the better. In our consulting rooms, it usually works pretty well. We have powerful language to describe our clinical observations. And we have many clinical models from all places that inform us with their theories of development, pathology, and to guide us to technique and even a theory of change. So we use our models to describe the problem and understand the conditions for change, but we've struggled to describe at the operational level what happens in the process of change that is common across therapeutic approaches. And it's been a challenge to make systematic operational connections between the clinical conversation and the underlying biological and developmental factors. And, I just want to go back for a second, if I can here, to show you, if I can. You can see here in the playground that the conversation links to models, but there's no link between the conversation and the models and the rest of the knowledge about human development and human function. So it's important to keep in mind that as clinicians, we can dwell in this area forever and be perfectly happy in the idea of using our models to inform our conversations with our patients. But that does not get us into a deeper discussion and understanding of what's going on. So those interested in studying the process of therapy have struggled with this fact for a long time. And now there are over 500 brands of therapy. And the problem is that they all seem to help. It's not a new problem. As far back as 1936, Saul Rosenzweig coined the term the dodo bird dilemma. He recalled a story in Alice in Wonderland where the dodo declared a race where everyone ran in whatever directions they wanted and proclaimed everyone is one and all must have prizes. So the clinical conversation is and will remain the most important activity and the crucible for change. And yet with all the power of 150 years of psychological clinical wisdom to heal, our understanding of what is common across treatments and how to make the links from the conversation to the underlying processes continues to be a challenge. So for many of us, the question remains, at an operational level, what are we actually doing when we do this fascinating and powerful thing that we do? If everything works, what are the workings of everything? How can we address the therapeutic process from a vantage point that is not refracted from the start by any particular clinical model or theory of technique of treatment? How do we use our current knowledge to see what happens in all therapies and thus address the dodo bird dilemma? So here's the challenge. How do we study how the words spoken in therapy connect with the multiple registers of emotion experience? How do we make operational, observable connections between the clinical conversation, the lines of words, and the underlying processes? What might help us look at the common factors so that we can better understand what really happens in the processes of change? So, to approach this, we do well to start with Susan Langer's observation that life exists in multiple registers. She says everybody knows that language is a very poor medium for expressing our emotional nature. It merely names certain vaguely and crudely conceived states, but fails miserably in any attempt to convey the ever-moving patterns, ambivalences, and intricacies of inner experience, the interplay of feelings and thoughts with impressions, memories and echoes of memories, transient fantasies, or its mere runic traces. So we need a way to understand how words spoken in therapy connect to this symphony of registers. And I think we are now able to bring new theory and technology to move our work forward. So let's start with the theory behind the methods and the measures and look at multiple code theory and emotion schemas. The concept of emotion schemas is associated with multiple code theory that was developed by Wilma Bucci and colleagues. The theory holds that experience is encoded in multiple interwoven channels, symbolic verbal, let me go back here. Okay, symbolic verbal, symbolic nonverbal, and non-symbolic or subsymbolic. At core, these are different ways of encoding affective, physiologically embodied processes. Okay, in case it hasn't been clear already, I'm going to take us into some weeds. But just remember that the gist of everything that I'm about to say is that we experience life in multiple registers all the time, and we represent these registers in various ways. While we can only say one word at a time, make one picture at a time, or do one gesture at a time, we are always processing the experience of living in an active dynamic that only some of the time reaches consciousness and is encoded in symbols. So what are we talking about here? Symbols are defined as discrete entities that refer to other entities and may be combined to generate new forms. They can be words or they can be images. Now, we know that words have the power to communicate experience across potentially unlimited domains of time and place. Verbal language also underlies the process of logic that enables organization of experience, identifying and labeling what belongs in particular categories and what is excluded. Note that the spoken and written words are the forms of representation that are directly measurable and observable, and no doubt that's why much of psychotherapy process research has been content-based. So symbols can also be images. Like words, images refer to other entities and can be combined to generate new forms. In contrast to words, though, they're only shareable to a limited degree. Visual and to a lesser degree auditory images are most readily represented in shareable form. Think, for instance, of Prokofiev's Peter and the Wolf as representing particular animals in auditory form. So non-symbolic processing is not based on discrete entities. Non-symbolic processing is based on gradients of experience. The various forms of non-symbolic experience occur continuously and simultaneously in multiple channels at varying levels of awareness, accompanying the symbolic levels. So the non-symbolic aspects of experience are central in interpersonal interactions and particularly crucial in relationships of psychotherapy. In their interactions, therapists and presumably patients as well are constantly attentive to changes in facial expression, body movement, tone of voice, speech rhythms of the others, and they respond to these things and modulate their vocal tones and movements in response to each other. Therapists are also attentive to their own bodily responses as providing information about the patient, themselves, and the interactions between them. And all of this information is provided in non-symbolic form, often in the background of awareness, only sometimes taking the center stage in interaction. So it's important to know that non-symbolic and symbolic modes of encoding do not occur in isolation. They occur continuously with various degrees of coordination over time. Non-symbolic processes, including sensory, somatic, and motoric functions, can become associated into categories and act as transitional functions between non-symbolic and symbolic modes. I'll give you a simple example. When I'm playing the blues on my drum kit, I'm hearing the chord changes in the other instruments. We refer to these movements of sound, the chord changes, with a symbol, the form. The form is a word that captures the movement through 12 or 16 bars of music. We use the term to know what to expect in the movements of playing, while the playing itself is purely procedural. This will sound familiar to you, hopefully, because the process of conversation that is central to therapeutic work also involves not only words, but also the non-symbolic functions of facial expressions, continuous variations of tones of voice, speech rhythms, as well as body movements and gesture. It's also clear that non-symbolic and symbolic mental processing can operate within or without awareness. Symbolic forms, particularly words, are generally experienced as dominant in conscious waking life, in talking or writing or in thought, but they can also operate outside of awareness. And non-symbolic representation of movement and sensory experience operate at continuous levels of awareness, from minimal, low-level wakefulness to focused attention, depending on both internal state and external circumstances. So these things that I just described are encoded in emotion schemas. So what are emotion schemas? To quote Wilma Bucci, they are clusters of feelings, including non-symbolic, somatic, and sensory functions that have been activated during emotionally charged events in a person's life. They are emergent forms of the massive parallel distributing processing of all domains of a living organism. When we encounter the world, it is our emotion schemas that filter information as our meaning systems. We can think of them as perceptual sets that, like lenses, influence what we see and feel, or, as is popular these days, as predictions that may or may not be available for updating as new information arises. Emotion schemas influence how we process emotional information, and they are, in fact, the key target of change in psychotherapy. So a couple of things. They develop from the beginning of life, well before language is acquired. They are built on clusters of memories of events of one's life in which subsymbolic sensory, visceral, and motoric processes are activated in relation to different people in a variety of contexts. Only later on, language may be incorporated into the schemas, and even then, only to some degree. There are concepts related to emotional schemas that I want to bring in here because it might help you feel more familiar in the territory. An emotion schema is a kind of memory built primarily through repeated affective experiences. They're basic modes of organizing experience that lay the foundation for all future development. Consistent with the principles of general systems theory and epigenetic hierarchical arrangement, these early networks continue throughout life. While new configurations emerge over time, these aspects of experience live in mutual influence with what has been and what will come. They're always there. So for some of you, it's probably worth noting that emotion schemas are akin to John Bowlby's concept of working models and Dan Stern's idea of rigs, or representations of interactions generalized. There are significant differences as well. Working models are perhaps more specific to the domain of relatedness, and as we know, Bowlby's work is foundational to attachment theory. And rigs, on the other hand, serve a more general idea of the automatization and generalization of a wide variety of experiences. Bucci's approach to emotion schema is different from these related concepts in the dominance and dynamic appearance of sensory, motoric, and somatic processes that make up their affective core. And as we shall see, references to the emergence of emotion schemas from the physiologic information processing aspects of their origins ultimately provides us with the links to affective neuroscience. So her notion of schemas has a more ongoing, dynamic, updating feel to it. In all, emotion schemas can be thought of kind of homeostatic organizations that function as predictions. We also think of them as homeoretic, that is, stable configurations of organizations that are updated as they move through developmental time. Think of it as a kind of a gyroscope that maintains its orientation in time and space while always adjusting to new inputs. That's how it stays oriented. When perturbed, those disruptions place a demand on the mind for work and re-updating. So let's take a second, take a breath, and go back to the overview of the playground. I've talked about the conversation, and I've introduced multiple code theory and emotion schemas as a way to capture these multiple registers. Now, let's turn to referential processes and the levels of interactions. The process of connecting experience and language is called the referential process. The referential process considers the many different types of experience that people have and focuses primarily on the question of how humans may connect experience with language in communication with others and in thought for themselves. The expression of all forms of experience in words, in writing, speaking, and in thought for oneself depends on this referential process. According to the theory, and you can reference the slide as I say this, the referential process, in the theory of the referential process, there is a constant flow of non-symbolic, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but it's this lowest level of non-symbolic experience within and between the participants. It's happening in everybody. The type of experience cannot be directly connected with words. Patient and therapist each experience the other in the context of their own non-symbolic activation. In each participant, the activation of the affective core may connect to particular associated memories or images that may involve their own life experience and may also involve their experience of the other person. These memories and images, as well as reflections on them, can be described in words. Notice that this very human exchange is also related to clinical descriptions of the interactive processes that we tend to call empathic understanding. Based on this idea of referential activity, Wilma Bucci and her colleagues identified three basic functions in the process of emotion communication as it occurs in the therapy situation and in a variety of other contexts as well. And these functions are characterized as arousal, symbolizing, and reflecting. These functions may occur in both participants and are bidirectional, operating in both speaker and listener. The method of development of these functions is beyond the scope of tonight, but I'll leave you with a link at the end if you want to explore this further. There's a referentialprocess.org website that goes into a lot of detail about how all of these things were developed. It's just way beyond our time tonight. So what I want to do, though, is I want to turn to how multiple code theory and the referential activity can be operationalized into these three processes of arousal, symbolizing, narrative, and reflecting reorganization. The theory gives us a frame of reference, but we still need measures to capture the referential process, how words connect to experience from a frame of reference that is beyond the intersubjective exchange. And these are the measures of referential activity. If you look at this, there's a reason why I have an EKG here, because what these measures do is like the leads of an EKG, which pick up electrochemical signals and are graphically represented, we can interpret these squiggles. And in fact, we can interpret these squiggles without really understanding much electrophysiology. It helps if you do, but you can identify patterns of cardiac functioning just by learning to interpret the graphic representation. As we'll see, arousal, symbolizing, and reflection are essentially the leads that allow us to access the processing of emotion schemas. If we do an EKG, we're not putting a probe into the heart. We're laying something on top of the body that picks up activity below the surface. It's the best image I can offer you to see what arousal, symbolizing, and reflecting does. So there are many sources that demonstrate that when people speak, their language style changes depending on whether they are uncertain, exploring, and defensive, whether they are speaking directly from within connections to their emotional experience, or whether they are reflecting on and reorganizing their emotional meaning systems. The fascinating thing here, and this is really to underline, this has nothing to do with the content of what is being said, but simply the way that language is used. And I'll tell you more about that. But I just want you to sit with that for a half a second. These measures are not related to content. So here are some examples of the manifestation of arousal, symbolization, and reflection processes. They are observable indicators that can be measured, made operational, and reported in graphic form. So first is arousal activation. This involves the activation of an emotion schema that is currently salient in the speaker's life. And it can be activated by events of the day or in a relationship. It can be activated by most anything. The affective core of the sensory and somatic components will be activated, but often not yet in a form that can be connected with words. The patient may not be able to access memories and images associated with the feelings that are activated, but may have a response of avoidance, withdrawal, or attack as a means of managing these activations should they be connected to a painful situation in the past that is becoming dominant in the session. Therapists are generally familiar with such phases of a session when the patient may be silent or may be struggling to talk. Such struggles are often associated with the beginning of sessions, but they can occur in the course of an hour as connections are made to schemas that have not been previously activated, including the schemas that the patient may well wish to avoid. The experience that is activated for the therapist will depend on the patient's communication as well as the therapist's own life. And how a session proceeds may depend on whether or not and in what form the therapist intervenes at this point. If a therapist is activated by a patient's activations and can't tolerate their own activation, they're going to move away from it. And that's certainly going to influence the interactive process between the two. So in this stage, there's a language style. It's characterized by high disfluency, words like like, well, kind of, high mixed affect without specific valences, and by a low degree of narrative and reflection. This stage of the process can be observed in the speaker's rhythm, speech rhythm, in the speaker's speech rhythms and vocal tones, and in their struggle to find words for their experience. The function may be minimal when the speaker has some immediate access to a particular experience, but at other times it may not lead, and at other times it may not lead to symbolizing at all when the activation of a schema is blocked or can't be retrieved in symbolic form. So it looks like this. Really, I don't think I had that feeling before. I mean, as yet, well, this really feels like I'm trying to, it's part of me, really, long pause. I don't know. It feels like sort of, I don't know. So that's a person that's activated, aroused, but it's not yet emerged into a symbolized form. The next is narrative symbolizing. And here we see that this style of language includes vivid and concrete imagery and action represented in high connections to emotions. Through communication in the session, which may be verbal or nonverbal, through the effects of the relationship or by other means, a component of the emotion schema, a memory or an image, may come into the patient's mind, and it is connected, maybe in a distant manner, to an affective core. The narrative may take the form of a fantasy, a dream, a memory, a story of a movie or a book, or even an event in the process as it's unfolding. The value of free association process is the patient will often tell stories or describe images without even first being aware of their emotional significance. And to emphasize this, when patients are talking, sometimes I might say, paint me a picture with your words, trying to encourage this form of narrative symbolization. The process can open connections with which they are not aware of, and they might have chosen to avoid. If this function is effective, the patient may come to relive the experience in the moment, including its sensory and bodily components, perhaps in a somewhat altered version in the new therapeutic context. So the third style of reflecting reorganizing, this phase is characterized by a high degree of reflection, lower emotional intensity, and affect words with a specific valence with some disfluency, but mainly sort of thinking it over, not really that it's the way I'm talking right now. There may be pauses in my voice as I'm gathering the words, but I'm pretty aware of what I'm going to say. The patient and the therapist together can re-examine the stories and images that have been shared, and new meanings can be found. Interpretations and reflective discussion of any form of narration or event, including an event in the therapeutic relationship itself, can explicate non-symbolic emotional meanings may not have previously been formulated. And affect words, names of emotions like anger, fear, love may be most useful at this point in the therapeutic conversation to help in the organization and reorganization of the emotion schemas. So let's go back to the measures and let's go back to the playground. And this is where we can see the general ideas in the playground as they appear in the application of a case. So this is the referential process. And I've been talking about the language style of arousing, symbolizing, and reflecting. And this is where we're going to move from a general discussion of this to an actual application of this to a clinical example that I will show you, a video, and the measures that are produced. So now I want to talk about the measures that can be applied to the text of psychotherapy sessions that reveal the activities of emotion schemas through the processes of arousing, symbolizing, and reorganizing in real time. How does this happen? Applying a general theory of emotional experience and expression, Bernie Maskett, who was himself married to Wilma Bucci and a conceptual mathematician and a dear human being, I might add, developed measures that allow scrutiny of the processes of emotion schemas using language style. Language use as it shifts during the process, rather than concepts, content, or categories, provides pointers to underlying processes. And through the use of computer analysis of these linguistic patterns applied to the text of sessions, it became possible to observe the connections between the linear flow of words and the processes that they are indexing. That is, to take the clinical conversation and observe connections to emotion schemas as they are evoked, symbolized, and transformed. And as we shall see, emotion schemas and the neuropsychoanalytic ideas are seated in common neurobiological principles. So now we have a bridge from the clinical conversation to the appearance of basic biology as they emerge in emotion schemas. And that takes us all the way so that now we are connected from the clinical conversation to the referential process and the measures, and that they, and I'll get into this if we have time, connect to the underlying complexity and neurobiological basis for not only emotion schemas, but of life as we live it itself. So the beauty of this approach and what separates it decisively from other efforts to explore the psychoanalytic process is that by identifying the fluctuation in emotion experience in terms of observable indicators, it's possible to sample subjective phenomena. Can you guys just make sure you turn off all of your make sure you turn off all of your oh wait, I did that. I'm sorry. Sorry, that's me. My apologies. That's me. I started the video too soon. That it's possible to sample subjective phenomenon without imposing a particular clinical theory or a priori category derived from psychoanalytic models to guide the selection, as has been the historical approach of psychoanalytic research. In other words, this gives us a way to have an objective look at subjective phenomena without imposing theories on it. So the measures of referential activity use language style, and they pick up symbolizing, arousal and reorganization. And they do an additional thing, which is they allow us to correlate the relationship between symbolizing and reflection. And as you'll see, there are graphs that show these inverse proportions. So these referential activity measures, the RAD, which measures symbolizing, the whirl, which is reflection, the rad-whirl correlation, and the Wursel, a funny name. It's the measures that capture these various forms of processes as they are activated. Again, the idea of an EKG is useful here to see how this operates. The method of producing the graphs that you will see is to run the clinical text through a program developed by Dr. Maskett that identifies the language patterns and processes them in a way that can be illustrated as a smooth moving line. Now, the initial measures of referential activity were actually the scales of concreteness, specificity, clarity, and imagery based on the features of language style that are widely recognized by experts on literary style as contributing to the vivid and evocative qualities of language. This style refers to the specific, generally prefers the specific to the general, the definite to the vague, and the concrete to the abstract. This is the symbolizing narrative that connects words to experience. And again, this should be familiar and not foreign. We all know from reading cases and from writing and presenting our own cases that the surest way to arouse and hold the attention of the reader is by being specific, definite, concrete, imagistic, and in the present tense. This style of language is more closely associated with bodily and emotional experience in the speaker than is abstract and general expression, and has more power to carry these qualities across to the listener. So I'm going to shift now, and I'm going to give you an example of how this works in real life. What I'm going to show you is a clip. It's about 4 minutes long. It starts with a long pause, so don't worry, it's working. And after I show you this, I'm going to show you the graphs that we generated from this session, this clip. And I'm also going to show you a graph that we generated from the entire treatment. So this is a clip of an actual session that I conducted with a real patient. And lest you worry, the patient gave full permission multiple times to use this material for training, education, and research. So it's okay that I can share it with you. And I must say that I am have deep gratitude to this person for allowing me to use this to further research and training. A tiny bit of orientation. Patient's an African-American woman in her 30s at the time of treatment. Her chief complaints were withdrawal, hopelessness, helplessness, irritability, and suicidal ideation. She sought treatment specifically to work psychologically rather than continue to rely solely on medication. She wanted to, quote, take the next steps in her personal and professional development. A goal that had sustained the patient over years was getting a bachelor degree. And in this pursuit, she had been taking classes for many, many, many years, but abandoned her efforts acutely when she had to move cities to seek care for a child with severe asthma. Despite all of her energy and resilience in the face of life's travails, it seems that this loss was the significant proximal precipitant for the patient's decompensation into suicidal ideology. So let's watch this and we'll come back.
I can't possibly explain the internal feeling of watching your child who's so near death and looking into the doctor and nurse's eyes and knowing that they are telling you in one way or another that there's no more that they can do. We just have to sit and wait and hope that he turns the corner. I remember a time when my son was 2 years old. This is the day that my ex-husband arrested my daughter. He was dying, if you will, from an asthma attack, and he had gone limp, and they were getting ready to intubate him. They drew his blood to test his blood gases, and his blood was purple. and he wasn't even fighting, he was just laying down. And they were sticking him with all kinds of needles and just doing everything. There had to be 7 doctors, I think, working on him, and just people everywhere. And one of the doctors pulled me aside and said that if he gets intubated, that there's a very high probability that he would never come off because he was so little. And I remember just in the midst of all of those doctors sticking and poking him and pulling him, and I said, "Get out of the way." And I climbed on his bed and I just put my arms around him. And he wasn't crying or anything, but he looked at me. I put my arms around him and I just sang in his ear, just sang to him anything I could think of, and just told him how much I loved him, and it's gonna be okay. And then I remember kneeling down and praying and asking God and telling him that I would do anything in my life, whatever he wanted me to do, if he would just save my son. I still haven't figured out what it is he wants me to do, but and it took about 6-7 hours. He didn't get intubated because he never officially stopped breathing. But it took about 6 or 7 hours, and he turned the corner and his lungs opened just a little. And we knew he was gonna be okay. And then that next morning, that's when I got the phone call with my ex-husband and the rest of my daughter. And I have existed in that state of panic ever since then.
Okay. So that's the clinical data. And now let's look at the result of running the text of this session through the discourse analysis program that produces the measures of symbolization and reflection. To orient you here, the x-axis are the word counts, the words uttered in the session. The y-axis represents the varying intensity of the symbolizing and reflecting processes over the course of the session. There are 2 lines here. One is bold and one is not. The bolded lines are me speaking, and the lines that are not bold are the patient. And the upper block is the symbolization function, or the RAD, and the lower block is the reflection measure. Now, I just want to say, when I did this research with the patients, with the researchers, they asked me to pick a clinical session that I thought was important in this, what was a fully video recorded 25 session brief psychotherapy. And I chose this session. The researchers ran the text of all the sessions, and without seeing, they never read the content of the text. They just ran the measures. So without me knowing about what they found on the measures and them knowing what the content of the sessions were, we both picked this session. So we divided this session into 6 themes that were based on transitions in the content. That's the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 at the very top. And we also identified 4 RPs, or referential processes, segments that capture the flow of the schemas in the session. The segment that you just saw was segment 5, or referential process number 3. Now, these squiggles in the top set here, the higher the line, the more intense is the referential activity. The more intensely connected are the symbols to words that, that have a motion style. The motion style is such of the most symbolizing words. This is a note that in the RP3 is the highest referential process of this session. And note also that it's the lowest reflective process of the session. So there's a high inverse span here. You can also see that in the very beginning of the session, there's lower symbolizing activation, and it's sort of relatively low, and there's sort of more reflection. It's sort of getting the session started. And towards the end, there's a lot of up and downs here, because the rest of the session, and as you can see, I'm more verbally active before. I don't say anything in the midst of this segment. I'm more verbally active before this segment happens, and I'm more verbally active after this segment happens. So this was as you hopefully picked up on, a highly intensely emotionally impactful sequence. And we spent the rest of the session essentially recovering from it. So I said more, and some of my own emotional activation went up, and we had many more interactions verbally back and forth as we processed together the treatment. So you can see that using these measures, one can follow the flow of the emotion activation and the reflection of these activated emotion schemas. Are they more intense? Are they less intense as they're being activated and reorganized? So that represents that's taking you from the clinical data to the output of the graphs as they are run through the program. This slide is a slide of the entire treatment. And again, on the left, it's on the x-axis are the number of sessions. On the left are the symbolizing reflection, the reflection symbolizing correlation, and at the bottom are just the number of turns. How many times the patient and I each spoke. The circle in the middle is the session that you just saw and that I just showed you. And you can see out of the whole therapy, it had, except for the very, very beginning, when the patient was briefly talking about her suicidal ideation and her life circumstances, this was the highest referential, the highest symbolizing activity, the lowest reflection activity, and the largest inverse correlation between the two. And also notice, if you look at the whole course of the therapy, this session had the fewest numbers of turns. And when you look at the flow of a therapy, you can kind of see that this is typically what happens. There's a lot of discussion in the beginning. the evaluation, the learning about each other, the getting the history, the talking about the arrangements for therapy. But as therapy begins to go, the patient takes over more and more, and the therapist may, in fact, say less and less, at least in a psychodynamically oriented psychotherapy. Towards the end, there's much more back and forth. There's much more, there's much less of an inverse relationship between emotion activation and reflection, because this is the working through process. This is the place where we're reordering, we're reviewing, we're relooking, we're reorganizing. And so in this, there's less intense emotion symbolization. There's way more turns taken back and forth, back and forth. So again, it's a way to graphically represent the flow of an entire session, and with, as I showed you, within a session. Note once more that you can pick up all of these things without knowing a single word that was spoken. There's no content in any of this. Of course, there's plenty of content in this clip I showed you, and clinicians are all about that. But the flow, what's going on underneath the surface, is not specifically tied to the content, but rather to the style of speech. So what does all this show us? It gives us a view of the process that grounds connections of language and emotion schemas. It shows us the flow from arousal to symbolizing to reflecting. It gives us a lens not refracted through psychoanalytic models or techniques. And therefore, we have an observable connection for tracking basic emotion schemas as emotion systems as they emerge, organized through emotion schemas. So since we have a little more time, I'm going to go on and, if you remember the playground, I'm going to talk some about this right side here, the place about navigating the dancing landscapes of development and the affective neuroscience. And the reason for reviewing this to you is really twofold. One is to remind us that emotion schemas are not disconnected from our bodies or from our physiology or from biology. Our emotion schemas are, in fact, the instantiation of those things. They are the emergent processes of all of these levels happening all the time. As I like to say, from DNA to the day-to-day, it's all there all the time. So there are two things that I'm going to talk about pretty briefly. And one is this idea of landscapes. There are three kinds of ways to think about landscapes. And this comes from complexity theory, and but I'll make it very quick and simple. A simple landscape is like Mount Fuji. If you want to get to the place of optimal functioning, you go up. You just keep going in a straight line to the highest place. It's a straight line. Because the idea of life is to operate in the optional way that we can. Not perfect, but the most functional way that you can. So the idea of life is, think of it as landscapes. One landscape is that we can just go straight up. Another landscape is like the Rocky Mountains, and this happens to be a picture of where the Coors commercial came from. And the Rocky Mountains are a rugged landscape. So as you can see, if you want to get to the highest point in this landscape, you might not be able to see the highest point from where you are. In fact, you might need to go down before you can go up. So it begins to feel a little bit more like the ups and downs of development, chutes and ladders. You go up a little bit, you fall down, you go up, but the landscape underneath stays pretty much the same. You just have to kind of figure out where you are in this kind of rugged configuration. But the third landscape, and this is the reason why it's animated, the third landscape is, imagine if you're on this rugged landscape and you're trying to go down and go up and go down and go up to reach the maximum level of functioning that you can arrive at. And all of a sudden there's an earthquake. and everything changes underneath you. And now what was high is low, what was low is high, everything is rearranged into different places. Now we're talking about what life actually feels like. Life, the metaphor for life is that it's trying to reach the maximal level of functioning on a dancing landscape. It's always moving. And our job is to try to adapt and adjust as the very landscape of our life happens. And it can happen in, it can happen in major ways. It can happen with trauma. It can happen with literal earthquakes, the loss of everything. But it can also happen because think of a child in an ordinary family. The child is changing. The child who walks at 5 is not living in the same body as the child who walks at 10. Their own landscape of their physiology has changed. Their parents have gotten older. So even though they're the same parents that they were born with, they're not exactly the same parents that they came into their lives with. So in subtle and gross ways, the landscape of development is always changing. And our emotion schemas are the memory system that's in our bodies that captures that entire functional movement over, in fact, the course of our lives. So landscapes are a really important metaphor for understanding what is happening in the emergence of emotion schemas. And the other thing that's really important is affective neuroscience. So basically, and again, I'm going to make this as simple as I can in the interest of time, but basically, we all come into life with a repertoire of emotions. We don't think of instinct and drive in the way that we did 100 years ago. We think that there are certain inherited um, um, uh, uh, emotion systems. Some people think they're natural kinds, some people they're already emergent. But the point is that we have a basic repertoire of things like seeking, panic, grief, rage, care, lust, fear, play. And they're sort of like homeostatic basic mechanisms that are on the same order, really, as CO2 and blood pressure regulation. They're homeostatic mechanisms that we enter life with. And each one of them is associated with a certain, if something goes wrong, there's a kind of reflexive or instinctual response to that. The problem with that, of course, is that life demands much more than rudimentary reflexive reactions. Life, it demands that we navigate the dancing landscape. So these basic systems, as they evolve over time, have a whole history of interplay with each other, evolution over time, um, transformation over time, interaction with each other over time. And again, emotion schemas are the emergent properties of all of those biological things happening all the time. And of course, they never stop. When everything stops, it's called death. So until we die, all of those things are operating all the time. So emotion schemas have common roots with affective and computational neuroscience. They're all connected to massively distributed parallel processing neural networks that includes the maintenance of well-being, homeostasis and homeoresis, and the computational things like predictive coding and Bayesian update, which I'm just going to say out loud, but we don't have really time to get into all the details of that. But what I'm trying to capture here in this slide is that emotion schemas are they're grounded in biology. So when we're accessing the emotion schemas in our patients through the clinical conversation that we can read through these measures, we're tapping into embodied experience of life. So I want to leave you with a little animation here that just says everything is here all the time. Emotion systems, emotion schemas. The patient comes to us like these boats, all akimbo. They can only say one thing at a time. And once the therapist, that's us, gets involved, there's a reorganization of the fish or the emotion schemas, the little dots are the emotion systems in biology. That what happens over time is that the system gets more regulated. Everything is there all the time, but the system gets more regulated and stable. And the outcome of therapy, if it goes well, is that the words make more sense. Nonsense becomes sense. There's a flow that makes more sense. The underlying emotion schemas are more ordered and orderly. They're all there all the time, but the overall function of the system is more adaptive and you can navigate in it. And that's really what treatment is. It's the ability to go from disorder to this ordered processing. So there's a couple of major sources for everything that I've said that I think you should all know about. One is this website, referentialprocess.org, and a book that Wilma edited, Emotion Communication in the Therapeutic Exchange, which is a really good introduction to this material for people that are interested. And I also want to express, a deep sense of gratitude to the Yellowbrick Consultation and Treatment Center for letting me do this, to Wilma and Bernie, who, much to my great pleasure, brought me on board to do this research with them, and the other members of the Pacella Clinician Research Collaborative Seminar at the New York Psychoanalytic Institute, which are all part of this. So thank you all. And I think we still have a little time for some discussion. And
Thanks.
have I stopped sharing my screen?
You have, yes. And I'm going to turn off the spotlight so everyone can be here at once. Thanks, Charles. This was fascinating. I've heard you talk about this before and learned more this time. It was really cool. Would you feel free or would you feel comfortable sharing your slides with the group if they ask for it?
Sure.
Okay. And so if you want the slides, you can communicate with us or with Tracy Ashworth, and we'll get them to you.
I'll send you a PDF of all the slides.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So there are some questions, but let me just, if you have a question now, you can feel free to ask it. I have one person send a question through chat. Why don't I read his question? It was Tom Sawyer, and he asked, let me read this here. Could you say something about the transition between the modes of arousal, symbolizing, and reflecting? Is there any particular significance to the moments of transition among them?
It's a great question. And in fact, when I got involved in this research project and we looked at that session that I showed you with this high arousal in the middle, and we looked at the trajectory and saw that this session had the most high arousal, I said, that's all well and good. But as a clinician, what I'm really interested in is what happened before it and what we do with it afterwards. That high activation is a little bit like abreaction in the old days. But as clinicians, when we work with this stuff, I want to know, why did it happen? And what do we do with it later? So if I'd have to go through the whole sharing it all again now, but in that slide, there's a period of time before the activation of that segment where there was more interaction between the two of us. And I was actually having a conversation with the patient where she didn't really agree with some of the things that I was saying. She felt that I was not really understanding the depth of her particular struggle. because two things had happened in the beginning in between the sessions. One is that she said that she had had a pretty good week. And the other is that her kids were away and she was very, very worried about them. Well, I focused on the fact that she had had a pretty good week beforehand, and it was not the right focus. So there was interaction between that aroused her, that activated the deeper thing that she was feeling. And I think that had something to do with the activation of that, why it emerged in that context at that moment. There was a process that came before. And then, as I said, the rest of the session was sort of the two of us dealing with it. And my first having to deal with the profound despair and mood in the room and kind of not really knowing what to say in that moment. And then the kind of two of us working to recover through that, through talking it over from various points of view. And to me, it was the arousal part and the reflection part that, as a clinician, were the most important to me. I mean, the emotion is important, but it's what makes it happen and what you do with it next that is the treatment process. So yeah, there's a lot of importance of that. And in fact, part of the reason that we developed the activation scale was that I said to them, I want to know what activated this. And at the time we first were working together, they didn't have that scale. So they went back and devised it as the result of our collaboration. So hopefully that's responsive.
That sort of sets up a question that Kristen Sundin asked is, can you comment on how to apply the research to the therapist monitoring of their own therapy or their own affective engagement?
Well, there are two things. Right now, we are working on making this software way, way more user-friendly. So you can actually record a session, right away run it through the program, and see what's happened in terms of the emotion schemas, activation and processing in the session that you just had. So the clinician can use it as a way of looking more from a different frame of reference into the process as it unfolds. The other thing is that some people are already using this for supervision. They're recording sessions, the sessions, they're running them through and making the graphs, and then the supervisor and the clinician are going over these together to look at the way content, theory, and emotion processing of the schemas either do or do not correlate. And actually, my particular area of interest is to see if there's a relationship between the reiteration of these processing modes of activation, of arousal, symbolization, or reflection, if there's a relationship between the reiterative appearance of these things and the process and treatment and outcome of treatment. Because this is a research method at the moment. And at the moment, we don't know. It's fascinating to see, but we don't, I mean, you could have a treatment where it looks like there's never any of these things and the patient does fine, or that there's all of these things and you still have a bad outcome. We don't know, but it would be very interesting to see if these common factors, and I should add at this point that these measures have been applied to CBT, DBT, crisis intervention treatment, psychodynamic psychotherapy. They've been used in Italian, Hebrew, Spanish, in different cultures and countries. So there's a lot of effort going on to gather data to be able to look at questions about how more clinically and immediately useful these things can be.
Charles, this is Bryn Jessup, and I wonder if you could say something about the thesis of Alan Shore's work, which increasingly and I'm going to oversimplify here, is it's all about the right brain in psychotherapy. And I'm impressed that the methodology that you've described tonight and exemplified here seems to validate in a certain way the truth of that, and also at the same time provide maybe some scaffolding for understanding how left brain, more linguistic processes dovetail with the nonverbal, symbolic, affective registers. Can you sort of say something about that, or is
Well, the short answer is
this
not well,
astray? Not well.
but I'll try anyway.
Okay.
This is how I see it, because I think we have a different foundational orientation to our look at this. Alan Shore is interested in brain function, right brain, left brain, brain lateralization. There are people who are looking at the brain as a complex dynamic system which operates through predictive coding. And if you look at it through that lens, by the time we get to talking about right brain, left brain, verbal encoding, emotional encoding, we're already at a hugely high sophisticated level of emergence. So you can do that, but it's a high level description, a high level look at a system that's already operating in much more elemental levels than that. So that's one. So it's a different kind of general approach to the whole how you even understand right brain and left brain functioning.
Right, right.
Again, you can do an fMRI and things will light up, but it's it's a description of something.
Mm-hmm.
But
Thank you. Yeah,
that's part of it. The other part of it is that the theory of multiple code suggests that everything is going on in non-symbolic, sensorily experienced, embodied, what people usually think of as right brain stuff. And it sometimes emerges in a way that can be symbolized in language, coded in symbols, verbal and images. So to me, that right brain, left brain, it all comes down to the right brain. Okay. But to me, that has limited reach in really understanding. And aside from that, it doesn't really speak directly about process. It's one thing to say therapy is all about the right brain. It's another thing to track the process over time. And these measures allow us to put metaphorical leads on the patient in the moment to track the flow of that. Is it going to be possible to correlate that with fMRI and see what lights up in the brain at the times of high emotional arousal? Probably. But that's a different way of entering the discourse than saying it all comes down to the right brain.
Yeah, thank you. That makes sense. I get it.
And you showed us the segments of both symbol, narrative and reflection. What does a graph look like in the arousal mode?
We're just developing it now, but the high arousal phase it captures the linguistic style of a lot of disfluency, a lot of pauses. In fact, I didn't bring it up because it's just too much for tonight, but there's a whole new generation of this program that's just coming out, which is not based on word count, but it's based on time. So it's much more sensitive and picking up rhythm, pauses. So you could see one of the reasons that I showed you that clip in the way that I did is because of the long pause at the beginning. the classic sort of pregnant pause. And that before the patient started talking, there was probably something being aroused in that patient before it was quite available. And we're trying to develop measures, nonverbal things like rhythm and tonality, that pick that up with more nuance. But right now, that part of it is still sort of in development. I'll add just one other thing that pops into mind. It has affected my stance as a clinician, because what I'm more attuned to now than I ever have been before is, are these things occurring in the process? And how am I facilitating or getting in the way of their evolution? And the content of what I'm saying, whatever sort of model I use to inform my understanding in the moment, becomes much less important. They do it. I mean, you have to do it, right? Because you have to organize the data of your own experience and organize what the patient's saying. But what I'm trying to listen for more is how this process is unfolding over the course of sessions and over the course of many sessions. And that's less content-based.
Tim, you had your hand up.
Yeah, just a comment. Charles, hearing all this throughout the presentation, I kept thinking about this passage from Ernst Chris's 1956 paper about the vicissitudes of insight in psychoanalysis, where he talks about the good hour. And he says, it starts sort of unpromisingly, you're not really sure where it's going, but then something happens and the patient takes off, maybe a dream or a new sort of perspective emerges. And what's so striking is that sort of, I mean, at the level of kind of a clinical description, like a good hour has been the same for 70 years, probably longer. And what's so striking about your presentation is the way that it fleshes out, well, what's actually going on underneath this sort of common experience of, that people were talking about in these terms 70 years ago and probably even before.
I completely agree. And, one of the nice thing about the language that you just used in describing that, he didn't cite anybody's model. He didn't cite anybody's theory. He made no interpretation about what in the world was going on. He just said, look at the flow. And if it's got this kind of a flow to it, I'm going to call it a good hour. And if you want to say this is the evolution of looking into that lovely comment 70 years later. But in the old days, people would say that and they would say, yes, but that's because the Oedipus was activated. And that's because there was a transference that erupted. And so they would impose the model of their pleasure on what happened and say, this is why you saw that. But everybody says that. That's the dodo bird problem. Everybody wins that prize.
Other questions or comments? I was just thinking about what this might look like for somebody who's hyperactivated, or even, who comes into a session, doesn't speak. And then I wonder what these graphs would look like with adolescents.
Me too. And by the way, people have begun to use this with, as we say, children of all ages. How does it look in an elderly population? How does it look in an adolescent population? How can it be adopted to work with children where language isn't as developed? Because everybody has emotion schemas. They're encoded and expressed in different ways, but they're all there in everybody all the time. So I'd be fascinating to apply it not only in different languages and different therapeutic modalities, but across the lifespan.
Yeah, the answer to the riddle about adolescence would be fewer sailboats, many more fish.
fewer sailboats and many more fish that were swimming in schools,
Probably, yeah.
right? Because there's a lot of fish, but they're
Right.
chaotic as hell,
Well, and
bumping up against the boats all the time.
we know the name of at least one of those adolescent schools.
Yeah.
It has to do with libido.
Oh,
Well, yeah. Well, but understand that the schools in my metaphor are emotion schemas.
Oh, right. Okay.
They're not one thing or another. They're they're schemas.
Yes.
And in adolescence, those schemas are aroused intensely in all these areas: play, lust, fear, rage,
No
they're
doubt.
all lit up, and
Yeah.
they're all forming, and they're like, bumping into each other and against the words and against you, and that's why the skies are dark in the first image. The outcome, what we like, is that those emotion schemas, or metaphorically, the schools of fish, which contain all of those things, are more ordered and organized and coordinated with one another, so that they're expressed in a functional line of words that can actually get along with other people for once.
this might be asking to look at the data in too refined a way, but you said it's been applied to different languages. Have they noted any difference in the cadence between languages? So, for, someone who, I remember hearing a friend who's Italian talking to his family, and I could swear they were having a knockdown, drag out argument. They were just talking.
Right. Well, here's a lovely way to end, and thank you for that. Most of the colleagues on this large project, and there are hundreds of them, are in Europe and mainly in Italy. So they've developed language dictionaries in different languages. That's what I meant: Spanish, Hebrew, Italian, English. So far, they're working on one in Turkish. It turns out that the emotion, to make it brief, the referential activity dictionary in English contains 790 words. In Italian, it contains 7,900 words. So the languages are not the same in the style. They all reference these same things, but the style that accesses them is not the same at all. That's why you may have heard. And those people may sound like they're fighting, but referential activity, maybe not.
Okay. Thank you very much. This was great.
Well, thank you for having me, and thanks to everybody that joined us.
And thanks for everyone
Thanks.
joining us. Yes.
Thanks, Charles.
Thanks.
Take care, everybody. Good night.
Take
Thanks,
care.
Charles. Bye.